Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Good morning, my friends. It's nice to be with you. I know I'm going to see a number of you later for our first ever Not Your Zadie's Seder, sponsored by the Men of Reformed Judaism of WRT. I'm really excited about this. We have over 120 people signed up for tonight. It's going to be a great, fun night. We have wonderful catering. We have a wonderful full-color, in-house produced Haggadah that illuminates all sorts of customs of Passover from around the Jewish diaspora, mostly outside of the Ashkenazi tradition. And we have wonderful leadership from Isaac Sonnet Asor, who's going to be doing all the music. And I'll look forward to being with everyone. Also want to thank so many of you who indeed showed up and I hope learned a lot and felt inspired by the presence of Rabbi Larry Hoffman, who was with us last weekend, and installed Rabbi Sasha Bacon, who's now traveling in Israel with a rabbinic delegation from UJA Federation of New York, representing Westchester Reformed Temple. I having just been there, as I think if you got the e-blast this morning from the temple, I also sent along a message with some action items that you can follow through on if you want to lend your voice to the movement for protecting Israeli democracy. So Sasha's there now, and we had a great weekend celebrating her arrival at WRT. So it's been a nice time at the temple, though not a time to kind of just sit and chill, which is why I'm especially grateful that I was able to take the last 3.5 days, give or take, to study Talmud and other texts, of course. But I was enrolled, as I do most years, in the Rabbinic Yeshiva Intensive through the Hadar Institute in New York City, and rabbis came from all over the country to learn together. So there are about 50 of us, Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, Reconstructionist, some non-denominational folks as well, and mostly just did a ton of learning in small groups, in big groups, one-on-one, and with an incredible faculty of rabbis and professors from around the world. So it was really an awesome experience. I'm feeling very full of Talmud right now. And at some point, I'm sure I will come around to teaching some of the materials that we encountered. Amusingly, we studied extensively yesterday morning the laws of Marit Ayin, which literally means that you would do something, or more likely that Jewish tradition would prevent you from doing something, or rabbinic law would prevent you from doing something, not because it is halachically impermissible, but because it looks bad. So case in point, suppose I want to go to I want a Diet Coke, and I'm a religious Jew, and I'm wearing a yarmulke, so everyone knows that I'm a religious Jew. It's considered improper for a religious Jew to walk into a non-kosher restaurant like a McDonald's to get a Diet Coke, even if the only thing that religious Jew is doing is getting and drinking a Diet Coke where there's no violation of the law. One is giving the public appearance that he's violating Jewish law, which does two things. One, it creates an opportunity for rumor around that person, but it also might send the wrong message to some other schmo who says, oh, I saw my rabbi go into McDonald's. I guess it's fine if I go in there too. So there's a whole category of Jewish law. But amusingly, we learned things like, suppose you wanted to drink a cup of fish blood. This isn't, see, we want to know what the Talmud talks about. Suppose you wanted a nice, refreshing glass of warm fish blood. Now, there's no problem with that, because fish is not meat. Fish is parv in the Jewish tradition. Follow? You can serve smoked salmon with cream cheese, but you can also have grilled salmon with, chicken skewers, and it plays equally well for a meat meal or a dairy meal. So fish blood doesn't violate any categorical restrictions. You can drink fish blood. You can't drink beef blood. Drinking blood is restricted from the Torah. Are you interested in this? I'm going to share it anyway. The problem with fish blood is What if somebody saw you drinking it and they thought, oh, he's drinking a cup of beef blood? Or even worse, what if he's drinking human blood? So how do you avoid this optics problem? You put the scales in with the blood. And then anyone knows that, oh, that's right. This is, so I spent 3 hours studying this text yesterday, right? Just so that I could have there are much deeper developments from this, a practical application. Perhaps it's not optimal for a youth group leader in a synagogue to be seen at a party on Instagram holding a beer in his hand, even though there's nothing wrong with it. The guy's over 21, right? So we think not just about, are we doing anything wrong? But we also think about what's the message that gets encoded in this behavior. And because Judaism is a tradition that doesn't really have a strong sense of mind your own business, Judaism has a very strong sense of my business is your business, which cuts both ways. Mutual responsibility is wonderful. There's also a certain prominently featured character type in most Jewish communities known as a yenta. You may know some of them. So you're right, they're stereotypes, but they're also, I think, indicative of the particular Jewish norms of community living. My business is your business. My business right now is to teach some Talmud. So thank you for that completely unrelated digression, but I'm just sharing with you my gratitude to you as my congregants for the opportunity to do 3 days of Talmud learning. It was wonderful with some wonderful colleagues. Okay. We have said the bracha. So we are doing a long form introduction to Gemara, introduction to Talmud. If not the unifying theme of this spring's study, and yes, I'm saying spring, although it's definitely not here yet. We're trying to will spring into existence. Maybe tomorrow for St. Paddy's Day, we'll all wear green and it will propitiate the grasses to come out. No, maybe not. But we're studying this spring selected Talmudic passages that touch on the nature, reasons for, and more importantly, responses to human suffering. Interestingly, Larry Hoffman put a deep emphasis on Judaism as a conversation that in an ongoing, sustained, and deep way responds to the human condition. Not, of course, only suffering, but also joy. But I was struck by how often he kept referring back in his talks over the weekend to the way in which Judaism is a sustained response to the human condition. And I like that very much as a framework for what we're doing. This is one way of unpacking that dimension of our religious practice. We are the people who is in a deep, sustained conversation about the human condition. And this text, this Talmud, is if not the definitive statement that we can endlessly unpack and discover its meaning. So we're going to bring on screen, we're going to start at the beginning of the daf, daf being the Hebrew word for a page of Talmud. You noticed, if you read carefully, the letter that I followed up class with last week. So Friday morning, Natalie sent out a letter. If you're not getting those, just drop your name in the chat window. If you're not on the list, the email list for the class, so that I can drop in your name and email, please, so that I can make sure that Natalie catches you, because I do like an executive summary of each week's class and a link to where I've uploaded it to the internet on YouTube every week. So usually it goes out on Friday. I try to get to it before Shabbat. I use the word sugya. I wrote it in English, S-U-G-Y-A, which just means a section. It's no defined length. There's no rigid definition for exactly what constitutes a sugya. It generally is just a unit of meaning in the Talmud. Not too big, not too short. A sugya can be part of a page, or it can go over multiple pages, depending on how expansively the rabbis treat a single segment or subject. So we're looking at a particular sugya today from Daf 7a. I'm just trying to use the nomenclature to acculturate ourselves to the way in which Talmud students talk about the material. As you can see, I'm up here on Sefaria, this really magnificent interactive database, web-based database of Jewish learning. I'm going to click on Berakhot, which is the tractate of Talmud, Babylonian Talmud that we're studying. And by the way, if I go back one level and you just click Talmud, there's a tab here, right here. I can choose either the Babylonian Talmud or the Jerusalem Talmud. We're studying the Babylonian Talmud, so I've highlighted Babylonian. I can decide whether I want things to appear in Hebrew. I don't, so I'm going to go back to English for now. And then I'm going to click on the tractate we're studying, which is Berakhot. I'm showing you this so you can do it yourself. It's really not hard. This is the William Davidson edition. I don't know, that's probably just the guy who funded it. And then you can click other versions, which basically we're looking at. You'll notice the graphic here. We're looking at the same edition that I have in print next to me, which is really wonderful, which has been made publicly available online. But other people have their own community, like the Sefaria community translation. This guy, Rabbi Mike Foyer, has his own translation, but we're going to use the same one that I have in print. And then I'm just going to click on Daf 7a, and that brings up the text. But what happened to my Hebrew? Yes, so I can click on this little friendly tab up here and go to Hebrew English and just select what I'd like. So I can do either all English, all Hebrew, Hebrew English. You can make the font bigger or smaller. It's really not hard. Once you get the hang of it, Sefaria is a tool that pretty much anyone can use. All right, now I just have to go back to where we are. Okay, that's 6b. You can see that there are all of these paragraph designations numerically. Those are just so that we can all, as it were, be on the same page. 7a, section 1. Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Yosei. Right, okay, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbi Yossi. And Amar means we are in the chronological stratum of the Amoraim, the Babylonian sages who followed the Mishnah. The Mishnaic sages are Tanaim, and there are various words that designate this is a Mishnaic teaching or a Tanaitic era teaching. We are now from the era of the Amoraim, where the word Amar, meaning he said or he discussed, the discussers of the tradition. Okay, so Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbi Yossi, Minayin, from where, Shehakadosh Baruch Hu mitpalel. From where do we get it that the Kadosh Baruch Hu, God, the Holy One of Blessing, or the Holy One, blessed be He, as your Haggadah probably says it, or as we just call him in rabbinical school, the KBH. The KBH is the Kadosh Baruch Hu, the big kahuna. Minayin she'akadosh baruch hu mitpalel, from the root word tefillah, meaning pray. So where do we get it that the Holy One prays? All right, this is already a fairly outrageous theological statement. How can we prove, the rabbis are asking, that God, as it were himself, I try not to use gendered pronouns around God, because I don't believe that God is a gendered being. I don't believe that God is a being at all, but that's okay. I try to avoid it. In some ways, it's unavoidable because language is limited by its, by its normative rules and functions. But where do we get it that the Holy One prays? And when we say, where do we get it? It's always a word that indicates that what is going to follow is some kind of a proof text. In other words, the rabbis want to prove a point or illustrate a point. They use text from the Tanakh, from the Hebrew Bible, to do just that. The Hebrew Bible, traditionally understood as the very word of God. So if you can find scripture that substantiates a claim that you as a rabbi many centuries later want to make, that bolsters your point, right? That gives you the proof you need to make the point. So where do we get it, scripturally speaking? that the Holy One prays. And it goes on from there to say, Shene'emar, for as it is written, right? So that's always going to be your answer. Where do we get it that God prays? Here's where. V'haviotim el har kodshi, I shall bring them to my holy mountain, el har kodshi, v'simachtim beveit tefilati, and I will cause them to rejoice from simcha, beveit tefilati, in the house, bayit, of my prayer. My prayer. That's the verse that the rabbis use to illustrate. See, here we have a verse that says, I will bring them to my holy mountain and make them rejoice in my house of prayer. But they're saying, literally, it doesn't say my house of prayer. It says the house of my prayer. And that subtle difference, it is tefilati that includes the personal suffix ti, meaning my prayer. Tefilatam lo ne'amar, it says here. Their prayer is not what is written. Tefilatam means the prayer of the people. Tefilat shelahem in Hebrew, their prayer. No, that's not what it says. Tefilatam lo ne'amar ela tefilati. It says my prayer, my meaning God's. Mikan, from here, ... it is derived, she'akadosh baruch hu mitpalel, that the Holy One of Blessing prays. All right, this is actually a fairly simple passage, so it's nice to begin that way. Everyone following it, we can look at it in the English just so you can see, but I really wanted to show you that every now and again, it's not that hard to translate Talmud. Along the same lines, Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbi Yosef, from where is it derived that the Holy One, blessed be he, prays? As it is stated, I will bring them to my holy mountain. I will make them joyful, or I will cause them to rejoice in the house of my prayer, from Isaiah 56. The verse does not say the house of their prayer, but rather the house of my prayer. From here we see that the Holy One, blessed be he, prays. Now, it may be grammatically simple, but it is theologically audacious. Right, so we're beginning with a premise where you just kind of have to go along with the ride here. The ride being, okay, the rabbis are now going to try and work in a framework where not only do the people pray to God, but God is also praying. That is strange. Right? It's just like, we don't think about it that way most of the time. Alan, do you want to chime in, please?
Who does God pray to?
Indeed. That's going to get answered. So I feel fairly secure that you'll get your answer momentarily. I want to read for you the commentary in the sidebar. It's very hard. There's a very large book, as you can see, by Adin Steinsaltz of blessed memory, the greatest Talmudic sage of our lifetimes, who died, I think, during COVID or shortly before. Not of COVID. He was well into his advanced 90s. Here's what it says. From here we see that the Holy One, blessed be God, prays. Much has been said with regard to these statements, and many homiletical and mystical interpretations were suggested in an effort to arrive at an understanding. Most commentaries hold that God's prayer is God's request of the individual and of mankind as a whole to turn to God with all their heart. In other words, if people repent of their sins and attempt to break the vicious cycle of one transgression leading to another transgression, they will cause God's attribute of mercy to prevail over God's attribute of justice, and even those deserving of punishment, those people deserving of punishment, will be spared. That said, God's prayer, so to speak, is God's wish or request of mankind, as in the line from Deuteronomy, and now, O Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you but to fear God, etc., and so forth. The fact that God's wish is characterized as a prayer means that God is showing desire and will, God's prayer, that man will, or that mankind can be better and worthy of God's bountiful blessing. That is a medieval commentary that Steinsaltz brings to bear on the text. So one popular line of interpretation is that the object of God's prayer goes back to humankind in order to spur humankind to repent of their sins and develop a meaningful relationship with the divine so that they can develop as spiritual beings and not be caught in the perpetual trap of our own moral frailty. question or comment, just go into the right. Judy writes, God is setting an example. Now, I wasn't sure any New Yorker knows that you put your drink into a brown paper bag. Oh, I see. You're going back to Marit Ayin, the doing things for the sake of appearances. Right. Yeah, Michelle, you're a smart teacher of Torah. Now, that's one possible explanation. My biggest problem with it is I don't think it's right. I think that if you look at what the Gemara actually says here, that's not what it says. So let's read on. The Gemara then asks, "My mitzale." What is God praying? Different word, an Aramaic word that means for prayer. My mitzale. What is God praying? And you have this fellow here, Amar Rab Zutra Bartuvia. So Zutra Bartuvia, Amar Rav, in the name of Rav, says, Yehi ratzon milfanai. I'm going to come back to that. Sheyikbeshu rachamai al kaasi. I'm going to translate these words just so you can see them. Yehi ratzon. If you've ever heard Yehi ratzon, you all have if you've been to services. It's a very popular prayer formula. May it be the will, right? Yehiyu l'ratzon imrefi. May the words of our mouths and the meditation of our hearts, but we say, may it be God's will. Yehi ratzon milfanai, literally in my presence. So it's self-directed. May it be my will. Yehi ratzon milfanai sheyichbeshu rachamai al et kaasi, that my rachmanas, my mercy, rachamai, that my mercy or my compassion, yichbeshu, literally will override or conquer et kaasi, my anger. So what is God's prayer? Because the content of God's prayer also says a lot about how the rabbis understand the direction of God's prayer. To whom is God praying? The answer here is God is not praying to or about humankind. It is entirely self-directed. God is saying, may it be my will unto myself, that my attribute of mercy will override my anger. If God is, as the rabbis visualize God to be, the judge of all the earth and of all living things and of us, God is constantly in tension between two attributes that kind of hold a attitudinal balance for the divine. On the one hand, as the judge of all, God must be fair, even strict. This is often called in rabbinic parlance midat hadin, the measure of God's justice, or the attribute, the character trait. One of God's character traits is that God is just. God is referred to as the judge. Even Abraham in Genesis refers to God as the judge of all the earth and holds God accountable to the allegedly innocent people in Sodom and Gomorrah. Shall not the judge of all the earth act justly? Abraham accuses God, right? So from the very first, one prominent or even predominant attribute of God in the Jewish tradition has always been understood to be God's justice. But that's not all. Otherwise, we would all be, I don't know if Russell's with us today, but one of Russell's favorite preachers from the American Puritan community, I think Jonathan Edwards, my namesake, right, Dad? Wrote a famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Look it up. You won't sleep well. And he basically says we're all sinners in the hands of an angry God. And the image that is used in this sermon, this, I guess, 17th or 18th century sermon, is that we are like a spider that God is dangling over the hellfire pit, right? And just God will judge us with the most strict measures of strict justice to determine our fate in the hereafter. But Jewish tradition says there's more. It's not just that God is just. It is also that God is merciful. God has din, judgment, on the one hand, and on the other hand, as it were, God has rachamim, which is compassion, or we say in Yiddish, rachmanas, right? Rachmanas is God's mouth. Here comes Russell. Perfect timing. That God is not only just, God is also compassionate. And the rabbinic tradition depicts these two polar attributes of God as existing in a kind of perpetual tension, right? lest God lean too heavily into the attribute of justice or judgment, the attribute of mercy will keep God in check. Lest God incline too compassionately in measuring our fate, the attribute of justice reminds God, as it were, that there still needs to be fairness in the world, right? You can't only be compassionate with sinners. We are not a tradition where our God always turns the other cheek. All right, I think I've said enough about that. Any questions about din, judgment, and rachamim? Okay, so knowing that as the kind of spiritual backdrop for what we're studying today, when God prays, the rabbis allege, God is actually acknowledging these polar attributes that are in tension with each other, but kind of like magnetic repulsion, they're also in balance. They're kind of holding a very fine line between being too judgmental or too strict or too mushy and compassionate on the other hand. And they're kind of like just in this dance where they're being held, each one holds the other in abeyance. And God prays in one direction only. God says, knowing that I have these two attributes and that I could go either way in how I treat my creation, I pray that I will always lean toward mercy and that it will overtake, and it doesn't say my judgment or justice. It says, may it override my anger. May I respond out of love and compassion, even when I'm pissed off. What we are seeing here is a highly anthropopathic God. It's a word I've used a lot. If you've studied with me for any length of time, you've heard it before. It is the proper way of talking about a God who feels, a God who has form, a God who has legs and lips and arms and a mouth and an outstretched hand and a mighty arm, is an anthropomorphic God, literally having human shape, morph, form or shape. An anthropopathic God is a God that is depicted as having human or human-like feelings. So the rabbis, contrary to what you may have been taught, the rabbis have a highly anthropopathic understanding of God. Their God is highly emotive in emotional registers that we as human beings intimately understand because we feel them too. These, of course, are all attributes ascribed to God. I'm not here to talk about God. I'm here to talk about what the rabbis talked about God. Okay, Mom and Dad, you can unmute and comment here, please.
Feel free to ignore me altogether if this takes us way far afield. But I am so struck by the anthropomorphizing of God, the need of the rabbis to, give God human characteristics, that I'm wondering if the eventual result of that sort of need is the let's say, popularity of Jesus Christ. Because Christ comes as an all-merciful anthropomorphization of God. I'm trying to think, I don't know the Christian text, but I don't know if there are examples where Jesus is not merciful, whereas, God is seen to be on both sides.
So first of all, I appreciate your generous invitation to ignore you. That's nice to have on video, but I won't. I'll actually entertain this because I think it's valuable. I'll also correct you gently and say, no, not anthropomorphic, anthropopathic. Jesus is both anthropomorphic and anthropopathic. I mean, Jesus is the definition of an anthropomorphic God, God made flesh. I mean, it is the extreme of anthropomorphism. But the God we're talking about is anthropopathic here, though you may not have known this, but the surrounding passages in the Talmud, just a couple dapim, plural of daf, Fe and Pe are the same letter in Hebrew. So dapim, a couple of pages earlier, there's a whole discussion, or maybe it's later, I don't know, right around here, within a page or two, there's a whole discussion of, does God wear tefillin? Now that's an anthropomorphic God. And the answer, of course, is, of course, God wears tefillin. And then the question is, so what's in the tefillin that God wears? We might look at it today. It's a fun passage. Yeah, I know Arlene's face is like, what? Yeah, they're very expensive too. So
Jonathan, just a minute.
Yeah.
I'm finding it rather almost irritating that we have to be so concrete when we're talking about God. And I'm thinking that maybe at the time frame that this was written, that they felt that this was one way to engage the population in a way that now we're not as dependent on it.
Yeah, in a sense, you're commenting in a similar direction, or even asking the same question my dad is, which is like, what does this tell us about the intended audience? And rather than resulting in the kind of, and if you take this to its logical stream, you end up with Christianity. The problem with that is it's chronologically off, right? So the Babylonian Talmud and the Moraim come at a time when Christianity is already a fairly developed tradition. And despite the fact that Judaism is often characterized as the parent religion to Christianity, that is really a misrepresentation of the development of our respective faiths. Rabbinic Judaism, the Judaism that we know and love and that we're spending all spring studying, and Christianity, at least root Christianity, nascent, early Christianity, are sibling traditions. They have differing but similar relationships with the Hebrew scripture. They both rely on the Hebrew scripture. They both have a substrate of Israelite religion. They both reject Israelite religion to different degrees and in different specific ways. But by and large, they are contemporaneous traditions growing up in the same part of the world, which means they're really in dialogue with each other, even when they are not explicitly in dialogue with each other. And sometimes I really have come to believe that dialogue with each other has been censored out of the tradition, that for reasons pertaining more to the politics of the time, the Gospels take an anti-Semitic stance. The Christian story evolves in a way that is explicitly anti-Semitic. And the rabbinic tradition grows up in a way that is less explicitly anti-Christian. And I think Jews had more on the line. For the Jews couldn't be as anti-Christian as the Christians were anti-Semitic, largely because of power, right? For the Jews to be anti-Christian at a time when Christians were achieving a kind of political security and even dominance in the ancient Roman Empire, or what would remain of the Roman Empire, it was a existentially dangerous thing, even in your writing, to have explicitly anti-Christian doctrine encoded into your public texts. Whereas for Christians, who themselves were originally persecuted by Rome, blaming the Jews for all of their tsuris was a much more logical and publicly permissible stance. That it was always okay to hate the Jews because you could propitiate your Roman masters that way. You say, oh, no, it's all the Jews' fault that Jesus was executed. That won't aggravate the Romans. Long story short, Christianity has a strong appeal to pagan culture in a way that Judaism never did. And I would submit that highly anthropomorphic and anthropopathic deities bespeak an attempt to relate within pagan culture. Now, how does it find its way into the Talmud? I don't know, but it's true that the Hebrew Bible is itself highly anthropomorphic and anthropopathic. Like, this is not new for the Jews. It is amplified in rabbinic tradition, it's amplified in Christian tradition. And then there's a strong backlash to it in Judaism, and probably in Christianity too. I just know less about Christian theological development. When Maimonides is the one who goes on record saying, God has no form. And if you believe that God has form, you are a pagan. So, but that's not till much later. So I would rather suggest that the development of the religions, plural, is much more subtle and in a kind of eternal dance with each other. That they're both commenting on and growing up side by side. And there are times when they are both drawing on similar norms in the development of theologies. and responding to a similar pool of potential, followers, spiritual seekers, and with similar substrates of text from what we call the Hebrew Bible and our Christian friends call the Old Testament, but ultimately diverge, except that this idea of an anthropopathic, anthropomorphic God really works its way into both of them. And yet at the same time, Jews will draw the line and say, and yet at no time was ever God made flesh. Right? So I think the Jewish tradition is much better about saying it's imagery. It's I say. You may take this theologically seriously, but at the end of the day, it's still literature. And Christians will say, no, when we talk about God having a body, we mean that literally. God was made incarnate, as in the Latin Mass, right? Et incarnatus est, from the Credo section of the Latin Mass. That is a declaration of faith in the Catholic Church that is essential for Christian theology. The God being made flesh is not a metaphor in original Christianity. I have plenty of Protestant minister friends who would say when they talk about God made flesh, it's a metaphor. So, okay. So I just want to, I want to take your basic observations, Arlene and Dad, and affirm that they're coming from, I think, a place of deep sensitivity to what the text is putting out and accurate familiarity with what you understand about Christianity, and simply say, yeah, and if you run with this, it's really very subtle and detailed, the way in which these two traditions are in a kind of dialogue with each other, but sometimes that dialogue isn't actually expressed, mostly out of fear that Jews would get killed for it. We can't say in our tradition all the things we might have wanted to say about Christianity. There are some fascinating texts in the Talmud itself about Jesus, by the way, but usually he is characterized as something like, I think there are so few of these, and I'm not really expert in it, but Jesus is like an Egyptian sorcerer who came to visit Nazareth and the Jewish people. It's a fascinating thing. Probably trying not to get Roman entanglement in what they were writing. Obviously, it pissed off the church in the Middle Ages, so that's why you have Talmud burnings, among other things. All right. So let's carry forth. Norm, or Norm's email, Norm's chat wrote, in the tension in Saul between having or not having a king, yeah, that's right, Saul, the first king of Israel, in the Hebrew Bible, God pleads with the people to reject a king, a mortal king. God is neither vengeful nor merciful. God is a supplicant. Thanks, Norm. I like that a lot. Yeah, okay. So let's proceed in our text here. So we're talking about God's prayer. May my anger not overtake my mercy, or it's phrased the other way. May my mercy override my anger. V'yigolu rachamai al midotai. And indeed, let my mercy, these four words, let my mercy prevail over all my other attributes. In other words, God recognizes that I am a God of many feelings and attributes. The one I hope will prevail in any given situation is my attribute of mercy, rachamai, my rachmanis. Ve'et naheg im banai, and let me behave. Nahag is actually a Hebrew word that means behave, but it's also the word for a driver. Like if you're in a taxi in Israel, you refer to your driver as nahag. Hey, nahag, driver. And linhog means to drive a vehicle. So may I drive or behave im banai, with my children, b'midat rachamim, through the attribute of compassion. And finally, ve'ekanes lahem lifnim mishurat hadim. And literally, may I bring them in, may I welcome them in, lifnim, before me, into my presence, mishurat hadin, literally beyond the letter of the law. Here they say, may I enter before them. Oh, wait, did I get that? Sorry, may I enter into their presence, lifnim, before them, mishurat hadim, beyond the letter of the law. It's a fascinating text. Let's move from mechanics to implications here. Like, what are the theological implications of a God like this God? Play it out, in other words. Yeah, Aaron.
He kind of just reminds me of me when I'm parenting my children. Like, I'm trying very, very hard not to lose my shit, for lack of a better term, but I don't always succeed.
Beautiful. So, you know, if you were kind of taking any given passage of Talmud and saying, okay, can we map this against something like the Avinu Malkeinu, our parent, our sovereign, or masculinized as the text actually is, our father, our king. This is more father language, right? This is the norms that are applied here are very relatable for anyone who is a parent, or I would add a teacher, anyone who has any interaction with kids, right? So raising my hand all day long, every week. I've had kids where I want to, like Homer Simpson with Bart, right? And I have to, and then it's helpful to know Berakhot 7a, and I can say to myself, may my measure of anger, or may my measure of compassion override my tendency to Homer Simpson my Bart, right? So, good. Judy.
Is there almost a foreshadowing of things that God does are going to be very scary or seem tough? He will seem angry, but we have to know he's trying to be merciful.
Beautiful.
But what's happening here? Are you the people the cause of my anger? Probably.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Remember that, you know, I chose this text deliberately within the context of a potpourri curriculum where we're focusing on human suffering. So, you know, most of us don't have a direct line to God. We're not getting, you know, God doesn't send us an email and says, on Friday, you're going to fall into a manhole and fracture your ankle. And the reason is I'm really pissed off at you for not giving tzedakah. It doesn't work that way. What happens is on Friday, you fall into a manhole, and because you are a person, or maybe you're a person with a religious upbringing, it doesn't have to be Jewish or Christian, but you have a religious upbringing, and you immediately go to, what did I do to deserve this? Come on, God. Right? That's the first thing we go to, because you're not going to blame the manhole. And you're certainly not going to, you might blame yourself. I ask a lot of people who injure themselves and they beat themselves up for it. They're like, I was just an idiot. I'm like, you were an idiot for walking? Sidebar, Mel Brooks has a great line. And by the way, I understand, I haven't seen it yet, that on Hulu, History of the World Part 2 is actually well worth watching. I have it on good authority from a rabbi friend of mine that it's great. Okay. Mel Brooks once said, tragedy is when I get cancer. Comedy is when you fall into a manhole and die. So, yeah, it's one of my favorite lines. It's one of my favorite Mel Brooksisms, right? Okay, but the point being, we are theological people, and I don't mean everyone in this room. It is normative for human beings to want things to mean something. I want there to be a reason for the things that happen. And so I think Judy is really pointing to what are the theological implications and what are the theological foundations here? They're rooted in human nature. Aaron said so too. Aaron relates to it as the way a parent can experience both compassion and anger at one's children. They even say my children in the Talmud text we're looking at. That's a really relatable God for anyone who's a parent or anyone who works with children. Judy says, I think in some, that this is about, there needs to be a reason for why I'm hurting. And that even God is struggling with the way in which God's children suffer. Okay, Dad, you want to comment here, and then we'll look at a little bit more text.
Seems to me this could have been the root text for Unatana Tokef.
Right. Yeah, great. Unatana Tokef, the Day of Dread prayer that forms the cornerstone of the liturgy for the mornings of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Right. Unatana Tokef Kiddushat Hayom. Let us declare the awesomeness of this day, or the tokef is a very strong word, not just awesome in the biblical sense, but that how dreadful this day is in all senses of the word dread, how fear-inducing today is. Kihu norava ayom, it is terrible and full of dread and terrifying. For on this day, all creatures stand in judgment before God. And then it goes on, even the angels tremble, we are but flesh and blood. So this idea of God is holding all of us, but in some ways it also softens it by saying that recognizing how terrifying it is that we ultimately are powerless when it comes to the things that will cause us to rejoice or suffer. Maybe it's not so simple that God is just, doling out punishment to the wicked, doling out reward for the righteous, that it's something more subtle than that God is, as it were, wrestling with how best to respond to the created world and living things and human beings especially. Okay, moving on. May I conduct myself toward my children. Now, Michelle Braun asked an interesting comment in the chat window. It says, my children, and you can see in plain type, not in boldface, which means it is not there. This is a gloss by the translator. May I conduct myself toward my children, Israel, with the attribute of mercy. And Michelle's like, well, wait a minute. Are we talking about just Jews? Or are we talking about everyone? I'm looking to see if it's here in Steinsaltz. Yeah, Steinsaltz adds in the word Israel, as if this is the way God relates to the Jews alone. But I'm not sure that the text is actually that clear. It just says, my children. So is this a particularistic God with a particularistic relationship or an exclusive relationship with the Jewish people? Or is this a God of all? I don't know. The wider context here is definitely Israelite in its kind of overall language imagery focus, right? We're talking about God's tefillin, and inside God's tefillin, by the way, is the prayer, who is like the people Israel? So yes, in the wider context of this sugya, of this section of Talmud, is a conversation that appears to be highly particularistic, God's relationship with the Jewish people. But it doesn't actually say so here. So I'm not quite willing to go and definitively do what Steinsaltz has done, which is put this word Israel into the text. It is not there. It just says Banai, my children. Moving on. May I judge them beyond the letter of the law. In other words, there's more to the way in which God hopes to interact with us, either us as humans, us as Jews, than eye for eye, tooth for tooth, wound for wound, bruise for bruise, life for life. Okay, moving on. Tanya. There's the word. Not like Tanya Harding. It's not a woman's name. Tanya. Tanya, which means it was taught in the Mishnah. Aramaic, Tanya is the same as the root from Mishnah. So it was taught, here it says in a baraita. Baraita means a Mishnaic era teaching. Tanya. If it wanted to say it was in the Mishnah, it would say mitane, same root, just conjugated slightly differently. So that there are all these very specific terminologies that help the reader know, when was it taught? Well, it was taught in the Mishnaic period, right? The period of the sages of Pirkei Avot that many of us studied together. Tanya. Amar Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha. Rabbi, we're going to switch to the English. Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha taught, and he was, by the way, the high priest. Once on Yom Kippur, I entered the innermost sanctum, meaning the Holy of Holies, to offer incense. Whoa. All right, so we're going way back to when the temple was still standing. I went into the Holy of Holies, and you could only do that if you are the high priest, which is why Steinsaltz clarifies that Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha was also a Kohen Gadol, is also the Kohen. I went into the Kodesh HaKodashim, the innermost chamber of the temple, to offer incense, like you do. Many of us, if you're awake enough and you're not too depleted from your Yom Kippur fast, and you make it to the afternoon services, do you remember in the old Gates of Repentance, the Maroon book, there was a whole section for the afternoon service? We used to do like a People loved it at WRT, by and large. I don't know if they loved it, but they had nothing better to do that day, so they were a captive audience, and they said they liked it. We had special music. We had David Krakauer, the clarinetist, come in, and we would do some visuals on the screen. Some people hated that, but nevertheless. And there was a very dramatic segment of the liturgy, which, by the way, was written in part by Rabbi Larry Hoffman. The ritual begins at dawn. The high priest, clad in his white robes, walks into the temple with the incense streaming. Like, they try and do this dramatic retelling of the ancient Yom Kippur ritual, where the high priest would go into the Kodesh HaKodeshim, the innermost sanctum of the temple, to offer the sacred incense. Okay, so that's the setup here. It's Yom Kippur, all the mystery and majesty, incense, and in a vision, well, that's not actually in the text. Beware the plain print. Read only the boldface. It doesn't say in a vision. It says, I saw a Katriel Yah, an Aramaic term for Adonai Tzevaot, the God of hosts, the great, majestic God of the armies of the Israelite people, or the divine armies. Here it says one of the names of God expressing God's ultimate authority. So thank you. Thank you, Steinsaltz. That's a very helpful gloss. Seated upon a high and exalted throne. See Isaiah 6. Hey, Sepharia, I do want to see Isaiah 6. Click. There it is in the sidebar. In the year that King Uzziah died, I beheld my Lord seated on a high and lofty throne, and the skirts of God's robe filled the temple. Okay, thank you. Very helpful to have the biblical text that seems to be providing the imagery template for this Talmudic sugya. All right, so I saw God. Oh, and you just want to close that to make more room? You close it. Easy. Sepharia, I love you. And God said to me, Yishmael, my son, bless me. Now we see why this fits into the sugya we're studying, right? We have this inverted theological framework for how prayer works. Wait a minute. A human being is being asked to bless God? Now, wait a minute. God prays? Now, wait a minute. God wears tefillin? That's not how this is supposed to work, right? So you have to kind of like go along with the ride that the rabbis are taking us on. Yishmael, my son, bless me. And I said to him, God, parenthesis, the prayer that God prays. Well, yeah, if you've been paying attention to the previous sugya, or the previous few lines, you would know that. May it be your will that your mercy will overcome your anger. May your mercy prevail over your other attributes, and may you act toward your children with the attribute of mercy, and may you enter before them beyond the letter of the law. This is an extraordinarily theologically audacious comment, right? It's Yom Kippur. It's the one day when the high priest can go into the temple. The high priest, according to rabbinic tradition, is supposed to pronounce the ineffable name of God and then come out before the people and cleanse them of their sins, ritually speaking. This is, as it were, a midrash, a rabbinic exploration or expounding of a, ancient idea, in this case, the idea of what really happens inside the innermost sanctum of the temple on Yom Kippur, what used to happen. And this rabbi, formerly Kohen Gadol, or who also is a hereditary high priest, just direct descendant of Aaron, says, I actually saw this. And God said, bless me, my child. And how did I do it? I know the prayer that speaks to God. And what did God say? God, the Holy One, blessed be God, nodded his head, anthropomorphic, okay, and accepted the blessing. But it doesn't say that. It just says God nodded his head. In other words, good prayer, my child. This event teaches us, and I love this, there's a little moral, and the moral of the story is you should not take the blessing of an ordinary person lightly. And as Steinsaltz glosses it, if God asked for and accepted a man's blessing, all the more so than a man must value the blessing of another man. Now that is another audacious statement. All right, what are we supposed to learn from all of this? The takeaway could have been that God needs our prayer, or that, God's anger can be mitigated by God's mercy. But the takeaway the rabbis want to say is there's actually an application. There's a lesson for all of us here. That if even the creator of the universe needs the prayer of an ordinary person. Yes, you could argue a Kohen Gadol is not an ordinary person, but that's clearly how it's being understood here. He's just a man at the end of the day. He's a man with fancy clothing, but he's just a man. So if God relies on human prayer, if God needs a human blessing, do not spurn the blessing of even an ordinary man. True story. I was in the city for the last few days for this rabbinic yeshiva. And I went out to dinner on Sunday night with a close friend of mine who was in from Chicago, a rabbi friend that I was actually in rabbinical school with way back. We had our year in Israel together, my buddy Seth Limmer. So we had a really nice dinner up on the Upper West Side where the seminar was taking place, went out to eat. And we ordered so much food and I had a ton of leftovers. And I said, the last thing I said was, I'll pay for dinner because I want to bring these leftovers home and Kelly will enjoy them. And I'm walking back to my car from the restaurant with a bag of tons of leftovers. And I see a young man, approach me wearing a sign. And the only thing the sign said was need food. And so I went up to him and I said, you need food. What's your name? We had a very brief conversation. I said, well, food I have. I gave him the bag of food. And when I tell you what happened next, it was really surprising. He said, may God bless you and keep you. I'm so grateful. You've sustained me. I mean, it was really like this. So the blessing to me was much more nourishing than the food would have been for Kelly. I apologized to Kelly and she said, what are you talking about? Of course you did the right thing, but it's not about that. It's about don't spurn the blessing of an ordinary person. That was the best blessing I've gotten in a long time. So, Mom and Dad, you can chime in on anything here.
So do we begin every prayer with something theologically audacious by saying Baruch atah Adonai?
Mm-hmm. Great observation, right? The way we the way we pray in Jewish tradition is we don't actually ask God to bless us. We bless God. I think too little attention has been paid to that dynamic over time. So most people say, well, it's just a poetic way of saying thank you, right? I don't like it when the rabbi or cantor says, and now we will bless the challah, or now we will bless the wine. That's not correct. You need an extra preposition in there. We will bless over the challah or for the challah. We will bless over the wine or for the wine. And it could be either over or for, depending on what you're doing. It could also be both. We will bless the day over a cup of wine for the privilege of having Shabbat together. That's actually what you're doing. But the object of the word bless is not the wine. Wine is not an object in that sentence at all. It's only indirectly an object. The direct object of the sentence is God. We will bless God for the wine, Borei Pri Hagafen. We will bless God over the wine for the day, Mikadesh HaShabbat. We will bless God, Yotzer HaMe'orot, who created the lights of heaven. We will bless God, who gives us the mitzvah of kindling Shabbat lights. We will bless God, who gives us the mitzvah of affixing a mezuzah to our door. We will bless God for giving us the mitzvah of enfolding ourselves in the tzitzit, the fringes of the talis. But we never bless the talis. The talis is not somehow transmogrified into a sacred object because we blessed it. We didn't bless it at all. You can bless God, or you can bless another living thing. You can bless another person. Parents can bless children. Children can bless parents. The high priest can bless God. God can bless the people. It's really, this is, and it is the mechanics and the mechanism of blessing that informs all of Jewish prayer. Lovely comment and observation. I'm so glad you raised it because it wasn't in my class notes for the day. Alan, Michelle, Jessica, in that order, please.
Well, it's the language, but it doesn't define the difference between prayer versus blessing.
It does not at all. You're right. I mean, I would put it this way. All blessings are prayers, but not all prayers are blessings, right? So in Jewish language, the category of what we call tefillah, and I don't mean just tefillah in the most limited sense of that word, which means the Shmona Esrei, the 18 benedictions of the daily service. That too is called tefillah. And when the Talmud or the rabbinic literature uses the word tefillah, it usually means it in the more narrow sense of the Shemona Esrei. I'm especially confident in saying that today because one of the seminars I took over the last 3 days was on the formation of the 18 benedictions of the tefillah. Normally, though, when we talk about, normally when the rabbis talk about tefillah, they mean that. But when I'm using it now, or the way you want to use it, Alan, we're talking about tefillah as an act or as a genre of Jewish spirituality. Tefillah, prayer. Within tefillah writ large, bracha, the formula, the spoken or written formula, bracha, that which begins with Baruch, is the building block. So Jewish prayer is made up of bracha or brachot. Brachot is the way in which most Jewish prayer is enacted. But it is also accurate to say you can have tefillah that is not made out of the Baruch building block. Right? So prayer is the big category. And it is God who says, when I pray, what is it that I should pray? Or the rabbis ask, when God prays, what does God pray? And it doesn't use the bracha formula. It isn't a blessing, actually. It's a yehi ratzon, which is a different formula. May it be your will, or in this case, may it be my will, that my attribute of mercy will override my attribute of anger. So I think you can clarify a difference, although in the Venn diagram of prayer and blessing, there's significant overlap. All blessings are a form of prayer. Not all prayer is written in the language of blessing. Okay, that's how I would unpack that for you. Michelle Braun next, please.
So this may, in fact, simply replicate what Alan just asked, but I was thinking about whether you distinguish blessing from praise.
Not all blessings are praise. And not all praise is blessing. And right, so the blessing that I was particularly studying a couple days ago was Birkat HaMinim, which is the blessing over the heretics. But it is not. I mean, it is praise, but it's basically, dear God, blessed art thou, O God, who destroys all the heretics. And then there's a lot more to it. But it's like, please, God, there are lots of bad people out there. Deal with them. Show them no mercy. I mean, it's a very problematic bracha. Fortunately, I am only the latest in a generations-long line of rabbis who don't like that bracha. So is that praise? Maybe, because it does end with Baruch atah Adonai, blessed is the one who destroys and uproots all the wicked. That's praise, sure. And by the way, interesting comment, sociological comment. During and after World War II, Jewish communities embraced that prayer much more than they do today. Right? Oh yeah, I can get behind praying to a God who will uproot wickedness from the earth and who will destroy all the bad people. Nowadays, in our days of, we could say, moral subtlety, or some would say moral weakness, we're more reluctant to say that. I believe that any prayer should just be left in the prayer book and people should just learn to deal with it because it's all poetry anyway. But that's my view. Like, I'm not supportive of the big change, but I grew up with this change, so I'm used to saying the second blessing of the Amidah, Atah gibor le'olam Adonai mechayeh. You grew up conservative or Orthodox, you say Metim, God resurrects the dead. Reformed Jews say Hakol. I'm like, we should have left in Metim. You don't literally have to believe in resurrection of the dead to make sense of that prayer, but that's me. Okay. Jessica.
Okay. So I don't have a background that a lot of this group has, but in listening to your father's comments, and someone else raised this as well, to me, when the high priest sees the vision of God, or just sees God, it's like God asking, like, what do you want from me? And especially on the occasion of it being the Day of Atonement, the high holidays, for him to ask for mercy over punishment, it seems to me, how much are there, I mean, if you were to boil down what we as Jews would want from our God, I think that is, at the root, what we would ask for. We wouldn't know to ask for that. So, I mean, I feel like it's the wisdom of the rabbis that they're giving us, that ultimately, if you were to ask God for something, that this is it.
Well, the only thing I can disagree with in that entire lovely comment is your disclaimer that somehow the people in this room outclass you in their knowledge. That was fantastic. I loved your insight, Jessica, and that's why you're here. So thank you. And everybody in this room, there's no bar for entry to my Talmud shiur. I really want to make that clear. So if you have friends and you're kind of like, I would hope that some of you have some friends and you've said to them something nice, like, I really like my Talmud class on Thursday mornings, tell them to come. Like, you don't need to be a seasoned student of Jewish text in order to be in this room. And if you ever have a question that I didn't sufficiently clarify, or something that felt like it was over anyone's head, you can always just email me or make a time to talk. Like, I enjoy this more than just about anything else I get to do as a rabbi. I enjoy a lot of being a rabbi, but this is the good stuff for me. So thank you. Thanks, Jessica. I really appreciate that. So on the subject of the vision, I'm also looking over at the sidebar in my printed copy here, seeing if there's anything there that's useful that you don't get on Sefaria. This is good. This is related. I did not look at this ahead of time, but I'll share it with us because I think it really plays into the conversation we're having this morning. Most commentaries maintain that this vision, the vision of Rabbi Yishmael and Katriel Yah, the God enthroned in majesty on Yom Kippur in the Holy of Holies. Most commentaries maintain that this was a prophecy seen by the high priest upon entering the Holy of Holies. You can find that in the commentary of Chaim ben Yitzchak and others. I don't know who Chaim ben Yitzchak is. The revelation in this vision is not in God's desire for man's blessing, but in the essence of the blessing. The blessing which Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha blesses God indicates the essence of all the blessings which we recite. Right? So that's what we've been talking about. Somebody said, wait a minute, Baruch atah Adonai, we're always blessing God. Going on, that's attributed to one Rav Shem Tov ibn Shaprut, which means he probably comes from the Spanish Golden Age, because he's got an ibn instead of a ben, which means that it's the Arabic designation of his name. And that was commonplace in, 11th century Spain, but I'll look him up. The blessing does not offer praise or thanks, for God does not require our praise. Again, according to this formula. Rather, it is a supplication that God will increase the bounty that is bestowed upon the world. Blessing means adding to the good that already exists. God's will is to be blessed, meaning that God wills that people will pray to God and request that God continue to lead them with loving kindness and mercy. That also is very much in sync, Jessica, with your own insight into the text here. And that's the Rashba. Now, the Rashba, I believe, is a 12th or 13th century French sage, but don't quote me on it. I'll have to look all these figures up. Okay, so we're going to read a little bit further. And go into this because we're still on the subject of God's anger and God's mercy, right? And so we have this nice little sidebar, which I love, by the way. This is often the way the Talmud discourses. I say, by the way, from this we learn that you shouldn't spurn the blessing even of a commoner. If even God needs a blessing from a person, so too should we. Okay. The Amar, right? There's your indicator that we're going to the Amoraic later layer of Talmudic discourse. Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Yossi, the same folks we saw up at the top of the sugya. And Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbi Yossi, from where is it derived that one must not placate a person while he is in the throes of his anger? Gloss, rather he should mollify him after he's calmed down. So now we're going to get into, so long as we're talking about an anthropopathic God that feels anger and that wants, despite that, to keep the divine anger in check through the attribute of mercy, let's really relate to this the way people can as people. What about anger? What about another person's anger? So that's how Talmudic discourse flows as well. Is this theology? Is it just, how to be a person? Yeah, it's both. It's not genre categorized that way. Right? It is this self-help. If you were looking this up in a library, the sugyot would have to be categorized in different parts of a bookstore. This part appears to be just good advice for how to deal with other people. The first section is about theology, but in Judaism, it's all commingled. So it's the same formula, by the way, minayin, from where, meaning how can we prove scripturally speaking, she'ein meratzin lo, that you should not try to placate another person, bisha'at ka'aso, when he's pissed off. So if I'm raging that the GD remote control is not working again, or that this is true, we just paid a gobsmacking amount of money to have an oven repaired, and 2 days later, it's on the fritz again. That's not true right now. We finally got it fixed. Mom and dad are like, I see that you're worried. No, you know all about the saga of the oven. But this did happen a few weeks ago. We paid a gobsmacking amount of money to have an oven fixed, and then 2 days later, it was on the fritz again. And I said some choice words in that moment. And because Kelly is just intuitively spiritually advanced, she never had to study this passage, this sugya of Talmud, but she knew there's a time and a place to placate me. And maybe when I'm raging isn't the time. Wait till I've calmed down. All of this by way of actually extolling my wife's ability to deal with me. So where do we learn this scripturally, though? That's what the rabbis want to know. So, there has to be a proof text for this. All right, as it is written, and we're going to go into last week's parsha, by the way, the golden calf. When following the sin of the golden calf, Moses requested that the divine presence rest upon Israel as it had previously. And God said to him, so this is all that's the background. Thank you, Steinsaltz, for helping the common reader like me know where we're talking about. My face will go and I will give you rest, a very strange phrase. Panay lechu v'hanichoti lach. Literally, my face will walk and I will cause you to rest or encamp. What the hell does that mean? Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the KBH, the Holy One, said to Moshe, Hamtein li ad sheya'avru panim shel za'am ve'aniach lecha, as it is translated here. Rabbi Yochanan explained, the Holy One, blessed be God, was saying to Moses, wait until my face, my red steam pouring from the nostrils, face of anger, of wrath, will pass. Za'am is the word here. Great word meaning really, really angry. That word that I've highlighted. And I will grant your request. Similarly, one must wait for a person's anger to pass as well. That's not in the text, it's a gloss. So, life lessons from the Talmud. Not only do we learn that God struggles with divine anger and prays when God prays, that divine mercy will override divine anger. There's a lot we can learn just in the human plane of relationship. 1, do not spurn the blessing of a common person. 2, when you're dealing with somebody who's really, really angry, wait till it passes, and then you can have a rational conversation. And then maybe your partner who loves you can say, perhaps there was a better way of dealing with that situation. And then I, for instance, can say, you make an excellent point. Right. So, life lessons from the Talmud. Is there more to say? Or is everybody with me? We'll read a little bit more. Okay, great. And this is another reason to love Talmud. It is not only esoteric. Written by people for people. All right. Now you notice it doesn't say ve'amar or detanya. In other words, we don't have an attribution. This is just what we call the stam, which means the plain or the simple. But in specific Talmudic nomenclature or terminology, stam refers to the anonymous voice of the Talmud, the stam. So here it just says the Gemara asks. This is just the Talmud, and when the Gemara speaks, it always speaks in Aramaic. So we've jumped. One of the challenges of really studying Talmud and teaching it, and the reason that I've waited 23 years into my rabbinate to even try to tackle a little Gemara as a teacher, is that it is very, very hard to jump between Hebrew and Aramaic, and you're constantly going back and forth in the languages. My Hebrew's good, my Aramaic is not good. I need so much help with Aramaic. It gets better the more you do it. It's really hard. Umi ika ritmakame ritchakame de kudusha barichu. So Aramaic. And is there anger before the Holy One, blessed be God? So now the Talmud jumps in and says, wait a minute. We've just spent an hour and 15 minutes going along with you rabbis on the assumption that God feels anger, that God prays, that God wears tefillin, as I referenced. Hang on for a second. How can we even talk about God having anger? So this is the kind of thing the Talmud also does. It's like upends the entire foundation of what we've been learning. But can you speak of God's anger? So let's see what they say. Can you? Now, the Gemara answers, in. In is Aramaic for kain. Kain meaning yes. Ditanya, how do we know this? We're going to go back to a Baraita, a Mishnaic era teaching. Ve'el zo'em b'chol yom. Scripture tells us, don't worry about this part, that's not quoted. God vindicates the righteous. God is furious every day. Or as, what's his name? The character that Samuel L. Jackson plays in Pulp Fiction, Jules, the gangster, right? He quotes a fake passage of scripture. But it basically goes, and I will smite thee in furious anger and great vengeance. It's this great speech that this hitman tends to deliver before he whacks one of his targets. I will strike thee or smite thee with furious anger. Okay, yeah. Actually, can we speak of God's anger? Well, don't take it from me as a rabbi. Take it from the Bible. Book of Psalms has a really angry God. That's also how Talmud works. Proceeding. All right, so now we've established that God does feel anger and that God has anger. But I'm a rabbi and I'd like to know more about this. So, v'chamazamo rega, how much time does God's anger last? All right, when God gets angry, what's it like? And the answer is, it's a rega, that word. Rega meaning but a moment. Even in modern Hebrew, you want to say, give me a second, you say rak rega, and you usually do your fingers like this, rak rega. Israelis do this all the time. American tourists feel that it's very rude. Like if you're asking for help in a store and the clerk is busy on the phone with somebody else, she might do this, rak rega. Just a minute, please. And it's always thumb pursed between four fingers, showing you the four fingers. That's an particularly Israeli hand gesture. It means, give me a second, please. All right, rak rega, rega. The chama rega. Well, how much is a rega? How much is this moment? God's anger is but momentary. Well, what do we mean by momentary? Here's what it says. How long is a moment? 1/58,888th of an hour. That is a moment. Okay, this is also very Talmudic. Oh, I'll tell you how long a moment is. It is 1/58,888th of an hour. I'm looking in my text here, and here's what Steinsaltz says in the sidebar. Rega, a moment. A moment does not denote a specific quantity of time. So you have to, I wonder myself as I was reading this, is this sarcasm? How long is a moment? And some other obnoxious rabbi in the back row of the yeshiva says, oh, it's 1/58,888th of an hour. That, by the way, I somewhat hesitate to admit this. That's the kind of thing I would have said in rabbinical school. The teacher says, how long is a moment? I would have put up my hand and said, it's 1/58,888th of an hour. That's how long it is, which is another way of saying, who knows how long a moment is? But okay, according to Steinsaltz, it is an unquantifiable period of time. Therefore, the moment is explained in different places as being of various durations, without these being considered contradictions. Consequently, a distinction must be drawn between this imprecise moment and the moment that is used in the precise mathematical sense as it appears in the Talmud for astronomical calculations. The moment, according to, thank you, Steinsaltz, I wouldn't have known any of this, is 1/76th of a chelek, which in turn is 1/1080th of an hour. A moment in that sense is 1 out of 80,080 of an hour. A variant text of the Gemara establishes that a moment is 0.044 seconds, which is actually close to the above calculation. But this is different. In other words, at different times, the rabbis give different answers for exactly how long a moment is. Does it matter? I don't know, but it's fun to talk about. Okay, let's read on. The Gemara adds, and no creature can precisely determine that moment when God becomes angry, except for one person, Bilam the wicked. Bilam the wicked is the Gentile sorcerer of the Torah portion called Balak, about whom it was written, Bilam the sorcerer, he who knows the knowledge of the Most High. Now, what will follow is a long discussion of Bilam the sorcerer and how he knew God so well that he could predict exactly when God would be angry. The story goes in like the 23rd chapter of the book of Numbers, thereabouts 20, 21, 22, 23. It's a long story about a Moabite king named Balak, who is in the business of fighting against the Israelites and who really desperately wants to prevail against the Israelites in battle. And in addition to doing so with conventional means, armies, also uses what we could call unconventional means, sorcery. And so he commissions this Gentile sorcerer, a fellow by the name of Bilam, to come meet him on a hilltop overlooking the Israelite military encampment and curse them, because that's what a sorcerer for hire does. Curses enemies so that they will fall in battle. After a whole bunch of bonkers hindrances to his quest, including a talking donkey that doesn't want to travel, and Bilam beating the donkey, and the donkey chastising Bilam and going, what the hell are you doing? I'm your donkey. Can't you see the angel standing in the middle of the road? All of a sudden, Bilam's eyes are open, and he sees what the donkey has seen all along. There's a fearsome angel with a sword drawn in the middle of the road, as if to say, don't do this. And then God intercedes in the story and says, well, you can do this, but you can only say the words that I'm going to put into your mouth. And so the God of the Israelites basically hijacks the sorcerer's mouthpiece. And instead of cursing the Israelites over and over again in the story, Bilam blesses them, most famously with the words that find their way into the very opening declaration of the morning service, Matovu ohalecha Yaakov mishkenotecha Yisrael. Looking down at the encampment of the Israelites, he says, how beautiful are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling places, O Israel. Words that I love the fact that the opening words of a morning prayer service are a quotation by a Gentile sorcerer who was out to curse us. You can meditate on that the next time you're singing Matovu. That is a real chap, a real inversion of fate, right? I love that. It says a lot about the Jewish people and what we value, I think. But anyway, so the Talmud goes on from here. The bigger question is, so there's a long discussion of God's anger, all of which is a way of reflecting on where we started today. It's like, well, how do we know that God is angry? The way we know, of course, is only through human experience. Unless you are Yishmael, the Kohen priest, who was also a rabbi, who had that face-to-face encounter. In a world without face-to-face encounters with the divine, we merely experience what we experience as human beings, and we impute those experiences to divine wrath or divine favor. And that's where I think I'm going to wrap for today in terms of my comments, but I would welcome any of your comments as well. This has been a rich and digressive conversation today, and we went in some really good places, I think. So, Russell, why don't you chime in, please?
Thank you very much. The precision by which time is measured in this passage
reminds me that the entire world was created in 7 days.
Hmm.
I believe that just as we humans feel the need to ascribe human feelings or other human qualities to God, we are the ones who exist in time. We are the ones who have deadlines. We are the ones who need to know the answer, how long is God going to be angry at me? We're the ones who need to know how long it took to create the world. But God does not need to know those things at all. And I would assume that it is that one who pretends to know that is indeed depicted as a sorcerer.
Lovely.
So my observation on this is that these are essentially ways in which the rabbis are reminding us that human experience and godly experience are really, it's really an absurd comparison.
Beautiful. Thank you. And again, one of the things you might enjoy doing, since Sefaria is radically open access by design, that's the vision of Sefaria, is that all people who want to have a relationship with Jewish text can have a relationship with Jewish text. It has fundamentally changed the game, by the way. I mean, to be a rabbinical student today, well, first of all, with the internet, I didn't really have, the internet existed when I was in rabbinical school, but it was the very beginning of the internet age. It was before the internet was really an interactive medium. That was more like 2002 with the advent of YouTube and people posting content. It used to be that you just went on the internet and professional websites would be created by people. So the content was not, there was no like crowdsourcing. So yeah, it's probably for the best that I didn't have like, an interactive internet, because I probably would have spent much less time in the library. But on the other hand, I have a tool like Sefaria. I guess it's good. I've gotten very good at using books, which I wonder if rabbis of the next generation or generations, or as Rabbi Hoffman speculates, let's say 250 years from now, what will be the relationship between rabbis and the books that make up the stuff of Jewish life and Jewish learning? I don't know. That's an idle speculation. If you do spend a little time between this week and next week wanting to go further into this passage, it's fairly readable and parsable, and it goes into all the dimensions of how long does God's anger last, what really gets God angry, like what gets under God's skin. I'll give you a hint. The answer is, in the morning, when the pagan kings get up, the first thing they do upon the sunrise is they bow to the sun. And the Talmud will go on just a few sugyot down the road, a few lines down the road, to say that really pisses God off. That steams God. So God starts the day angry that so many, potentates are bowing before Narishkeit. But then God calms down, because how long is a rega? Like that. Michelle. Oh, unmute. Sorry.
Briefly, to reference technology between when the rabbis wrote that and your Sefaria, to some extent, our precise numbers are the difference between a slide rule and a calculator or a computer. The slide rule gets you close enough; it gives you a good quick number for most purposes, without implying precision that is in fact meaningless, and something that statisticians try to teach kids. You need precision, but there's a time when precision is not, it becomes not, that extra precision is not really there. It's just a fallout of the calculation. That was the first thing. The second, and I think you've just undermined what I was going to say, is I was going to use the people are created in God's image, and to say I think much of our anger is in fact, explosions are in fact directed at ourselves.
Yeah.
And so the question is God's anger directed at God's self?
Well, the good news is we're returning to this next week. So, I don't think what I said undermines. I think rather that it nuances or shades that premise. When we return next week, we're going to look at Berakhot 7a. We're going to still, there's so much more on this stuff. We're going to skip over a bunch of the stuff on anger, though that's where we got to today. But it leads directly into the question of suffering. So just as a little bit of a teaser trailer, we're going to pick up the second part, or the lower part of the daf, the page, where Moses wanted to ask God. So the Talmud speculates that Moses, when he was up on Sinai, he asked God, show me how the world works, and show me your ways. And what the Talmud interprets that to mean is, show me why the righteous suffer and the wicked prosper, which in and of itself is an amazing read into an ambiguous statement. So when Moses is on Sinai and he says, I prithee, I pray to thee, show me how you go, show me how you work. And what the rabbis say that means is, show me why the righteous suffer and the wicked prosper. And that's where we're going to pick up next week. So this all we needed today as a kind of preamble. It would not make sense next week without understanding that the rabbis have this deep and deeply explored notion of divine anger, of an anthropopathic God, and of a God who can be, is it too bold to say manipulated, propitiated, regulated, modified in action through prayer? And with that, we shall depart until next week. Tomorrow night, Shabbat begins. We have a really nice service tomorrow night. I'm doing a year look back on my visit to Poland to meet with Ukrainian refugees. That was a year ago this week. And I am really honored that we have the founding CEO of AFIA, which is a humanitarian relief organization that operates really on a shoestring budget to assemble and donate humanitarian supplies to communities in need, particularly refugee populations. They've been at the forefront of our work as a Jewish community to respond to the crisis in Europe, in Ukraine, on account of the Russian onslaught. So Danielle Butin, who is the founding CEO of AFIA, will be our special guest, and she and I will do a little bit of a dialogue in the middle of the service about the work of AFIA. So I think it'll be a really nice opportunity for you to learn more about the ways in which we can provide small but sustained assistance for a community that really needs it. So that's a little bit of a trailer for tomorrow night, and it will also be St. Patrick's Day. So
We're green.
We're green, as the Rebbitzin McCormick would say. Yes. Keep calm and drink like a McCormick. Okay. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much. Have a
Shabbat
good
shalom.
week.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Kol hakavod, John.
Thanks.